Hi, I'm Bill Jackson, and today I want to talk to you about sourdough bread or pain de levain, which is a fancy French word for sourdough bread. And levain is basically leaven, and in this case, it's natural leaven. It's not made with commercial yeast. And that's the way bread has been made for thousands of years before commercial yeast was available. You need three ingredients, and it's just flour, water, and salt. That's it. But the type of flour is important. You can use all-purpose flour. If you do, use a little bit less water than in this recipe. But all-purpose flour only has about 11% um, protein content. The higher protein content, the better gluten development and structure and rise you're going to get in the bread. Bread flour has about 13% and whole wheat about 14%. And I've been using this artisan bread flour from Hayden Mills, which is fantastic. And that's 14%. And it's a nice protein content. First thing you need to do is make the sourdough starter. And to make sourdough starter, what you do is you mix equal amounts by weight. That's why you need a gram scale of water and flour. So let's say you put in 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water, mix it, cover it, leave it out in the sink or in the closet or wherever overnight, and just every couple of days scrape out half of it and put more flour and water by weight. It doesn't matter how much. Like you could put 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water so you don't waste a lot of flour. And you do that every couple of days for a couple of weeks and you'll have this nice bubbly starter. And sometimes it takes, though, for like maybe a month or so to really develop well. But once you have the starter made, you can just stick it in the refrigerator, and then when you want to make bread, you take it out of the refrigerator, and you don't want to use old starter. You want to refresh your starter. So when you take it out of the refrigerator, then you just scrape everything except a little tiny bit. So if you look at the left picture, there's just a little bit left, and that's the starter after I scraped out almost everything. And actually, I just leave 1 or 2 tablespoons. That's a little much even in that picture. And then put new flour and water in to refresh it. Now, this recipe, you need 200 grams of levain, and levain is basically just the refreshed starter that you use to make the bread with. So I would put 150 grams of flour and 150 grams of water in it, and then I would do that the night before I'm going to make bread, and the next morning it's nice and risen. You can see in the picture on the right, and it's nice and bubbly. You can see in the picture in the middle. You can actually see the bubbles coming up like it was like a tar pit or something. And you want to use the starter, or I mean the levain, it's the same thing really, while it's still rising. And what I don't use of the levain, I just put the top back on and stick it back in the fridge, and that would be my new starter. You could refresh it a little bit if you want, like add another 50 grams of flour and water in it before you put it back in the fridge. And so now we're ready to make our bread. Oh, by the way, the starter, it doesn't matter what kind of flour you use, but if you use a little bit of wheat flour, it will usually become a little bit more vigorous. Um, so to make the bread, you start with 1,000 grams of flour and 700 grams of water and mix it up. So if you look at the left picture, I just put the bowl on the scale and I put in 900 grams of bread flour and 100 grams of wheat flour. Now, if I use artisan flour, I just use 1,000 grams of the artisan bread flour, which it's really nice flour, and instead of mixing white and wheat. But you can mix any types you want. If you put too much wheat flour, though, it's not going to get as good as a rise. So I would keep the wheat flour down a bit. And then I'll put in 700 grams of water into the flour and mix it up. Now, it doesn't matter what kind of water. I'm using bottled water there, but I use tap water and it works fine. And it's room temperature water. Then I'll put in 200 grams of the levain and mix that up really good. Lately, I've been putting the water, the 700 grams of water in first, then the levain, and mixing that up so it's nice and liquidy, then putting the 1,000 grams of flour in. But either way, you get the same result. And after you mix that flour, water, and levain together, you're going to let it rest. That's called autolysis, for the gluten to develop for 30 minutes. Let it rest covered. After that, I put 20 grams of sea salt and 50 grams of water and mix those together, and then mix that into the flour and the water and the levain mixture, and squeeze it really good with my hands, and maybe take a rubber scraper and scrape around the bowls and get it nice and incorporate it, then cover it and leave it another 30 minutes. Now we're ready to start kneading the bread, and I use the folding or turning method. At the beginning, you can make your folds and turns more rigorous, but at the end, you want to be much more gentle. So to make a turn or a fold, it's the same thing. Basically, what you do is you dip your hand in a little bit of water and stick it underneath, let's say, the right side of the dough, because I'm a righty, and then pull it up from underneath and fold it over into the middle. Then turn the bowl uh, another 90 degrees and do the same thing with the other side, another 90 degrees, the same thing with the other side, and another 90 degrees. So basically what you're doing is you're pulling it up from the bottom, from the four corners, and pulling it onto the top. And then you cover it, and then you do that every 30 minutes for about 2 hours. And that is the beginning of your bulk fermentation. After that, let it sit covered without bothering at all for another 2 to 4 hours. So the time varies depending on the temperature. So in the winter or summer, your kitchen might be different temperatures. So you do it till it's about doubled in volume. So if you look at the left picture and the right picture, you can see the volume has increased significantly. Usually I would probably let it go a little bit more than that, so the volume's developed a little bit more. I've been usually bulk fermenting for about 6 hours, so the turns for the first 2 hours, and then another 4 hours to rest covered. Now that it's bulk fermented, scrape it onto the counter. You don't need to put a lot of flour. Actually, you don't really need to put any flour, even though the picture there's some flour there. And scrape it onto the counter, and take a bench knife, and you could sprinkle a little tiny bit of flour in the top middle of it so the bench knife doesn't stick, and you just cut it in two with the bench knife. Then taking the bench knife, you might need a little bit of flour on the bench knife so it doesn't stick. You basically form it into two balls, and these are going to be 2 loaves of bread. And you do that by just sticking the bench knife underneath and just kind of like pushing it a little bit from each side, like gently, until you form it into a ball. And then what you're going to do is cover it with plastic wrap. I usually sprinkle a little bit of flour on the top, not much, so the plastic wrap doesn't stick, or with a tea towel. And you're going to let it rest for 30 minutes. And in that time you're letting it rest, you're going to prepare the banneton, and that's a basket, wicker basket. You could also use like a bowl, like a kitchen bowl, by putting a tea towel on the bottom of the bowl. And whether you're using the bowl with a tea towel or a banneton, you need to sprinkle flour. And I usually sprinkle a combination of rice flour and white flour, because the rice flour doesn't stick. And what you're trying to do is keep the dough from sticking to the banneton or the bowl. So you flour it really well before you put the dough into the bowl. And after you've let the dough rest for 30 minutes, basically what you're going to do is take the bench knife and put it underneath and flip it over. And the reason why you're flipping it over is so that the part that you put a little bit of flour on the top is now on the bottom. So you could sprinkle with like a little bit more flour before you flip it, and that's going to be the floured side is going to be on the bottom. You don't want to use a lot of flour. So now I'm going to shape it. So if you look at the left picture, what I'm basically doing is kind of stretching it out a little bit, and then taking one side and folding it into the middle. And basically what you want to do is just keep grabbing corners, and let's say you take the left side, fold it into the middle, the middle, fold it into the middle, and so you keep folding it into the middle. And there's a couple of different ways you can do this. I mean, one way is you just kind of stretch it out with your hands and fold it like an envelope, and then turn it the other way and fold it like an envelope into three. Or just like pull the corners up into the middle. So basically what you're doing is you're kind of like stretching it and like kind of creating it like a tight ball, and then like just kind of give a little crimp in the middle part, so like all those pieces that you brought to the middle will kind of come together. Don't put a lot of force into it. You don't want to squeeze all the air out of it. Then turn it over, and now form it into a nice smooth ball. And the way you do that is just kind of cup your hands around the ball and just kind of like move it around in a circle a little bit. You can kind of drag it across the counter, not the floured part of the counter, unfloured, to create a little bit of tension until you have like a nice smooth ball. And then what you're going to do is you're going to put it into the banneton. Now, if you notice the picture there, there's a glass of wine in the back. You might want to have that available too. Not to put in the bread, but to drink. Now, you put the top side that you had before down into the banneton. So the bottom side is up. And then you're just gonna, I usually sprinkle a little bit of flour around the edges of it. So like when it rises, those edges don't stick to the banneton. And there's two different bannetons there. The one, if you look at the right picture on the bottom, that's oval shaped, and that is to make a batard. And the one on top is round, that's to make a boule. And then you cover it with plastic wrap or with a tea towel and stick it in the refrigerator overnight. This is called proofing it. And it just proofs in the refrigerator. There's nothing you have to do. And then the next morning you take it out and it's ready to make your bread. So now when you're ready to make your bread, what you want to do is preheat your oven with a Dutch oven inside it. You're going to use a Dutch oven to make your bread. And you preheat the oven to 500 degrees. And when the oven's preheated, I take out the banneton and I take a piece of parchment paper and just turn it upside down. And if you see the middle picture, that's the upside down, the loaf emptied out onto the parchment paper. And I usually take like a brush and just brush off all that excess flour. Then I'll cut around the parchment paper so there's not so much extra hanging out, and then score the bread. And you can score the bread, that just means making small cuts in it with a serrated knife, like a good sharp one, or a razor blade, or sometimes they call it a lame. And you just make a few cuts. And the reason why you're doing that is because when the bread rises, if it doesn't have those cuts, it's going to like burst and it's not going to look nice. It'll still taste good. So you score the bread, and now it's ready to go into the Dutch oven. Now the Dutch oven has been in preheating, and so now what you're going to do is you're going to drop the bread into the Dutch oven and you're going to cover it. And then you're going to bake it at 500 degrees Fahrenheit, covered for 15 minutes. After 15 minutes, turn the oven down to 450 degrees, but don't uncover it. Let it bake another 15 minutes. Then uncover it. So if you look at the left picture, this is after it's been baking for 30 minutes, covered, 15 minutes for 500 at 500 degrees Fahrenheit, and 15 minutes at 450 degrees Fahrenheit. You can see how it's risen, and it's got this nice brownish color already. Then you're going to let it bake covered, maybe for about 10, maybe 15 more minutes, anywhere between 10 and 20 minutes, until it's nice and brown, and then take it out of the oven. And with I usually use a spatula, and make sure you've got a mitt, oven mitt on, so you don't burn yourself. And you've got to be careful in this whole process not to burn yourself. And then take it out and put it on a wire rack and let it cool for about an hour. So you want to make sure you let it cool, because you don't want to cut it too early, because then the crumb, that's the structure on the inside, isn't going to be as nice. It's going to be like gummy. In fact, there's some famous French baker who says, don't cut it till the next day. But I would say, let it cool for at least an hour before you cut it. And now here's your two nice loaves. On the left is my batard, and the right is the boule. And so after it's cooled, then we cut it open, and you see there you have your nice crumb. It's got nice holes. Like, I think the good bread should have like medium size and small holes. Sometimes people like to have really big holes, but I really don't think that's the ideal size hole to have. And then you can slice it and do all kinds of wonderful things with it. It tastes especially good toasted, and there's lots of recipes you can look up on the web for all kinds of things you can do with sourdough bread. So I hope this was helpful, and don't be discouraged if it doesn't come out perfect the first time. It takes a lot of experimentation. There's some good videos online. Hopefully one of these days I'll make some and I'll let you know if I do. So I hope this was helpful. Happy baking.